A cold wind swept across the Mall in London, carrying with it the first whispers of a scandal that would threaten to undo the British monarchy. It was a Thursday morning in mid-February, unremarkable in every way except for the dark cars that pulled up to a sprawling Norfolk estate. Inside, on his 66th birthday, the man once known as the nation's favorite son was about to face the consequences of a lifetime of questionable judgments. That Andrew Mountbatten Windsor had always believed himself untouchable. The second son of Queen Elizabeth II, he had been her favorite, a golden-haired boy who had gone to war in the Falklands and returned a hero. But the decades that followed had stripped away the gilded veneer. First came the friendship with Jeffrey Epstein, the convicted sex offender who moved in circles of power and privilege. Then came the photographs, the ones showing Andrew with his arm around a teenage Virginia Giuffre, his face sweat-sheened in a London townhouse. The BBC Newsnight interview had been the beginning of the end, a car crash of an explanation that convinced no one. Now, as police officers escorted him from his home for questioning over allegations of misconduct in public office, the image was devastating. Photographers caught him slumped in the back of a Range Rover, his face a mask of bewilderment and indignation. This was no longer a prince of the realm, but this was a man being held accountable by the very institutions his family had represented for 1,000 years. Buckingham Palace released a statement within hours. It was remarkable not for its warmth, but for its cold, clinical distance. King Charles III, the statement read, offered his full and wholehearted support for the investigation. The law must take its course, the king declared. There was no mention of family loyalty, no suggestion of brotherly protection. The contrast with his mother's approach was stark. Just 4 years earlier, the late Queen had rushed to Andrew's aid, helping him settle a civil lawsuit brought by Giuffre for an undisclosed sum. Charles, it seemed, was made of different stuff. Across London, in the gilded rooms of St. James's Palace, the royal household began to mobilize. The Andrew crisis was not merely a legal matter, it was an existential threat. For years, the monarchy had weathered storms, the abdication of 1936, and the death of Diana in 1997, the departure of Harry and Meghan. But this was different. This was a senior royal, the brother of the king, sitting in a police interview room on his birthday. Historians would later compare it to the darkest days of the House of Windsor. As the news cycle exploded with commentary and condemnation, one figure remained conspicuously silent. Princess Anne had engagements that day in West Yorkshire, visits to prisons in her capacity as patron of the Butler Trust. When fog grounded her helicopter, she did not cancel. She simply boarded a train, bought a ticket like any other passenger, and continued on her way. It was, those who knew her would say, utterly typical. The Princess Royal understood something that her brothers sometimes forgot. Duty was not a performance. It was not waving from balconies or posing for photographs. It was showing up day after day, year after year, even when, especially when, the family name was being dragged through the mud. Now, at 75, Anne had seen it all. She had been second in line to the throne when her mother became queen, only to watch her younger brothers and their children leapfrog her in succession due to outdated rules that favored males. She had faced a kidnapper on the Mall in 1974, famously telling Ian Ball that she would not go with him, thank you very much. Bloody likely, she had said when he threatened to shoot. She had endured divorce, scandal, and then the relentless scrutiny of a press that once dubbed her royal rudeness for her refusal to pretend. And now, as the monarchy faced its gravest crisis in generations, Anne prepared to do what she had always done, keep calm and carry on. But this time, she would not simply carry on alone. Behind the palace walls, in conversations that would never be recorded, she would become the voice of reason her brother desperately needed. The king might be the sovereign, but his sister was the steel. The days ahead would test them all. Camilla, the queen, would find herself navigating treacherous waters as public scrutiny intensified. The Duke of Sussex, watching from California, would see vindication in the chaos. And through it all, Anne would work, visiting prisons, attending charity events, shaking hands in freezing church halls, proving by her example what the monarchy could be when it remembered its purpose. The crisis had begun, and the response would define a reign. The morning after Andrew's arrest, the king's private secretary arrived at Buckingham Palace before dawn. He carried with him a thick folder of briefing documents, legal opinions, and polling data. The numbers were grim. Public approval of the monarchy had dropped 12 points in a single week. Social media had erupted with comparisons between Andrew's treatment and Harry and Meghan's departure, with many noting the apparent double standard. And Harry had written in his memoir, Spare, about how his family had not removed Andrew's security detail as they did with his, adding pointedly, "Whatever grievances people had against us, sex crimes weren't on the list." Charles read the briefing in silence, his face betraying nothing. At 76, undergoing treatment for cancer, he might have been forgiven for wishing for quieter times. But the crown did not permit rest. He had waited 73 years to become king, and now, barely 3 years into his reign, he faced a test that would define his legacy. The decision to distance himself from Andrew had not been easy. They were brothers, after all, bound by shared history and blood. But Charles had learned from his mother's mistakes. Her instinct to protect Andrew had only prolonged the agony, allowing the scandal to fester. His approach would be different. Transparency, accountability, and an unwavering commitment to the rule of law. That afternoon, the king convened a meeting at Buckingham Palace. Present were his private secretary, the palace communications team, and via secure video link, the Prince of Wales. William had been forceful in his private conversations with his father, urging a harder line against his uncle. The younger generation, it seemed, had less patience for the old ways of silence and obfuscation. But one voice was conspicuously absent from the formal meeting. Anne had declined the invitation, and preferring to continue her scheduled engagements in the north. She would come to London that evening, she said, and they could talk then, privately, without the apparatus of advisors and communications directors. It was a characteristically Anne move. She had never been comfortable with the media circus that surrounded the most high-profile royals. Her influence was wielded in quiet rooms, in conversations that left no paper trail. Richard Fitzwilliams, he's a royal expert who had observed the family for decades, noted that Anne's no-nonsense approach was her essential attribute. She reportedly did her own makeup, sometimes drove herself to engagements, and was famed for recycling outfits decades old. That evening, the siblings met in the king's private apartments. The conversation was, by all accounts, direct. Anne did not mince words, a trait that had sometimes caused friction between them over the years. But Charles listened. He had learned, and over a lifetime, that his sister's counsel was worth hearing. What Anne offered was not legal advice or communications strategy. It was something more fundamental, a reminder of what the monarchy was supposed to represent. Their mother had understood it instinctively, the importance of service, of showing up, of letting actions speak louder than words. The institution had survived centuries because it adapted, because it stood for something beyond the individuals who inhabited it. You cannot save Andrew," Anne told her brother, according to palace insiders. "You can only save the crown." It was harsh, but it was true. Andrew's fate was now in the hands of the police and the courts. The monarchy's task was to demonstrate that no one, not even the king's brother, was above the law. Charles had already begun that work with his statement, but Anne argued that more was needed. They had to show the public what the family stood for, not just what it stood against. And the conversation turned to the broader challenges facing the institution. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex remained estranged. their criticisms of the family still fresh in the public mind. Harry's memoir had painted a devastating portrait of palace operations, alleging that staff would feed negative stories to the press to protect other family members. The king had not yet found a way to bridge the chasm with his younger son. And then there was Camilla. Yet the queen had come so far from the days when she was vilified as the other woman in Charles and Diana's marriage. A YouGov poll in 2005 had found that just 7% of the public thought she should be queen one day. Now, nearly 2 decades later, she had earned a measure of acceptance through years of steady work and genuine warmth. But the Andrew crisis threatened to reopen old wounds, to remind the public of the family's capacity for scandal. As the siblings talked into the night, a strategy began to emerge. They would not hide. They would not circle the wagons. They would continue their work, visible and unapologetic, demonstrating by their actions what the monarchy could be. The king would address the nation in due course. William and Catherine would increase their public engagements, and Anne would simply keep doing what she had always done, showing up day after day in rain and shine, in cities and villages across the kingdom. Before she left, Anne paused at the door. "You know what Mum would say," she reminded her brother. "Keep calm and carry on." It was a cliché, perhaps, but it was also the truth that had sustained their family through wars, scandals, and tragedies. The king nodded. He knew what he had to do. 3 days after Andrew's arrest, Queen Camilla arrived at a literacy charity in East London. The photographers were out in force, hoping to capture a moment of tension or distress. They were disappointed. Camilla moved through the room with the ease of someone who had spent decades learning to ignore the cameras. There was a time when such attention would have been unbearable. In the 1990s, after the release of the infamous Camillagate tapes, a secretly recorded phone conversation between her and Charles that was intimate and embarrassing, she had been the most hated woman in Britain. Paparazzi hounded her every move. Tabloids printed cruel caricatures, and she retreated to her country home and wondered if she would ever be able to live a normal life again. But Camilla Parker Bowles, as she was then known, had something that her detractors underestimated: resilience. She had grown up in the upper classes, the daughter of Major Bruce Shand, and had learned early that composure was a survival skill. Her great-grandmother, Alice Keppel, had been the mistress of King Edward VII, and Camilla reportedly told Charles when they first met that she was descended from a royal mistress. It was a line that demonstrated both her confidence and her connection to the family's complicated history. The road to acceptance had been long and painful. After Diana's death in 1997, Charles hired a public relations team to rehabilitate Camilla's image. They introduced her slowly, carefully, orchestrating first appearances at private events before gradually moving to public engagements. When they married in 2005, the first civil ceremony for a royal in England, the couple had to move the date to accommodate the Pope's funeral. It was, in many ways, typical of their relationship, love persevering despite endless obstacles. Now, as queen, Camilla faced a new challenge. The Andrew crisis threatened to undo years of careful work to remind the public of the family's capacity for scandal. But she had learned something valuable from those dark days in the 1990s. The only way through was forward. At the literacy charity, she spoke with volunteers and children, asking questions with genuine curiosity. She had made literacy one of her signature causes, along with osteoporosis awareness and animal welfare. These were not photo opportunities to her. They were genuine interests, pursuits that gave meaning to her public role. A young volunteer, nervous in the presence of royalty, I stumbled over her words. Camilla put her at ease with a self-deprecating joke. "Don't worry, my dear," she said. "I still get nervous when I have to speak in public, and I've been doing this for nearly 20 years. It was vintage Camilla, warm, unpretentious, human. Petronella Wyatt, a journalist and friend, had once described her approach. "She's always in a good mood. She's not stroppy and difficult. I think she'll shine quietly while letting Charles be the star." But shining quietly did not mean being passive. Behind the scenes, Camilla was playing a crucial role in the family's response to the crisis. She had experience with public vilification, and she understood what Andrew's alleged victims had endured. In private conversations with the king, she urged compassion for those affected by the Epstein scandal. Her advocacy for victims of sexual assault, long a quiet part of her charitable work, became more visible, and the contrast with Andrew could not have been starker. While he had spent years denying, deflecting, and defending, Camilla had done the hard work of earning redemption. She had shown that it was possible to move from vilification to acceptance through consistent, humble service. That evening, as she returned to Clarence House, Camilla received word that the palace communications team had drafted a statement about Andrew. It was careful and measured, reiterating the family's support for the legal process. But she felt something was missing. She picked up the phone and called the king's private secretary. "We need to say something about the victims," she told him. "Not just about Andrew. About the people who were hurt." The next morning, the revised statement included a line expressing deep sympathy for all those affected by the events now under investigation. It was a small addition, but it signaled something important. The family understood that this was not just about them. As the days passed, Camilla continued her engagements with undiminished energy. She visited a hospital, attended a reception for Commonwealth diplomats, and hosted a reading event at Buckingham Palace. Through it all, she maintained the good humor that had become her trademark. The public began to notice. Social media, once a source of cruel commentary about Camilla, now featured posts praising her grace under pressure. "She's been through worse than this," one user wrote. "If anyone knows how to survive a royal scandal, it's her." It was true. Camilla Parker Bowles had weathered the storm of the century and emerged as queen. She knew better than most that the only way out was through. 800 miles away in the sun-drenched hills of Montecito, California, Prince Harry watched the crisis unfold on his television. The images of his uncle slumped in the back of a police car brought complicated emotions. There was, he would later write, a certain vindication in seeing the institution he had fled now grappling with the very issues he had tried to expose. But there was also pain. Andrew was still family, despite everything. And watching the palace distance itself from the disgraced prince reminded Harry of how he and Meghan had been treated when they stepped back from royal duties. And in his memoir, Spare, Harry had been unsparing in his criticism of the family's double standards. He wrote about how palace staff would feed negative stories about him and Meghan to protect other family members. He described asking his father not to marry Camilla, fearing it would cause more harm than good. And he accused Camilla of sacrificing him on her personal PR altar to rehabilitate her own image. Now, watching from California, Harry saw patterns repeating. The family was again circling the wagons, again protecting its own at the expense of transparency. But there was a difference this time. Charles had acted quickly, stripping Andrew of his titles and making clear that the law must take its course. It was the kind of decisive action Harry wished had been taken when he and Meghan were facing racist press coverage and institutional neglect. Meghan found him in the den, staring at the television with an unreadable expression. She sat beside him, saying nothing. They had learned, over 6 years of marriage, that silence was sometimes the best response. "It's just," Harry began, then stopped. He gestured at the screen. "They could have done this for us. They could have protected us like they're protecting themselves now." Meghan took his hand. She understood the complexity of his feelings. This was not simple schadenfreude. It was grief for a family that seemed incapable of learning from its mistakes. and the irony was not lost on either of them. Just weeks earlier, they had sat courtside at the NBA All-Star Game in Inglewood, looking relaxed and happy as they chatted with Queen Latifah. The contrast with the grim-faced royals in London could not have been starker. Here, in California, they had built a life of purpose and privacy. There, in England, the family was once again tearing itself apart. But Harry could not entirely escape the pull of his heritage. When the palace announced that Andrew would be stripped of his remaining titles, he felt a flicker of something like satisfaction. His uncle's fate was proof that no one was above accountability, a principle Harry had long argued should apply to the entire institution. In the days that followed, Harry and Meghan continued their humanitarian work. They joined the World Health Organization in Jordan for visits to a refugee camp and a hospital caring for medical evacuees from Gaza. The work was meaningful, far removed from the palace intrigues that had consumed so much of their lives. Meghan, in particular, seemed to thrive in this environment, her natural warmth and empathy finding outlets that the stuffy confines of royal life had never permitted. Yet the pull of family remained. Harry spoke occasionally with his brother William, though their conversations were strained, laden with unspoken grievances. He had not spoken with his father in months. The cancer diagnosis had prompted a brief exchange of messages, but no real reconciliation. As the Andrew crisis deepened, Harry found himself reflecting on his mother. Diana had understood the media in ways the rest of the family never had. She had known how to use publicity, how to connect with people, how to tell her own story. In her famous 1995 interview with Martin Bashir, she had spoken about Camilla's presence in her marriage with devastating simplicity. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. That line had haunted the family for decades. Now, as Andrew faced his own reckoning, Harry wondered what his mother would have made of it all. Would she have been pleased to see the institution she had struggled against finally facing accountability? Or would she have felt, as Harry sometimes did, that the whole thing was simply sad? On a clear California evening, Harry and Meghan walked in their garden, the Pacific Ocean glittering in the distance. They talked about the future, about their children, their foundation, their work. They did not talk about the royals. There was finally nothing left to say. In the north of England, Princess Anne was doing what she did best, working. The Andrew crisis was a distant hum in the background as she visited a factory in Sheffield, a school in Manchester, and a hospital in Leeds. At each stop, she shook hands, asked questions, and listened with the focused attention that had become her trademark. The public response was remarkable. People who had waited hours in the cold to see her did not ask about Andrew. They did not bring up Harry and Meghan. They simply wanted to meet the princess, to shake her hand, to thank her for showing up. At a community center in a working-class neighborhood, an elderly woman pressed a bouquet of wilted flowers into Anne's hands. "You're the best of them," the woman said. "Always have been." Anne accepted the flowers with a small smile. "That's very kind," she said, "but we're all just doing our jobs." It was classic Anne, dismissing praise, deflecting attention, focusing on the work. Those who had followed her career were not surprised. She had always been this way, even as a young woman. In 1977, a year after competing in the Montreal Olympics, she had joked to an interviewer, "When I appear in public, people expect me to neigh, grind my teeth, paw the ground, and swish my tail, none of which is easy." The joke revealed something important about Anne's approach to royal life. She understood the absurdity of it, the gap between public expectation and private reality. But she also understood the duty. Her mother had been queen for 70 years, and Anne had spent those decades learning what service meant. It was not about glory or attention, it was about showing up. The numbers bore this out. Since the pandemic ended, Anne had averaged 451 engagements a year, more than any royal except the king. In 2024, a reporter from the Telegraph had followed her for a week and emerged exhausted and awestruck. Professional and precise, she barely stops. Every hand is shaken and every minute counts, the journalist wrote. But Anne's influence went beyond sheer volume. She was, royal experts agreed, the family's trump card in times of crisis. Now, her reputation for integrity and duty stood in sharp contrast to the scandals that plagued her brothers. When the public looked at Anne, they saw the monarchy at its best, hard-working, humble, and genuinely committed to service. That commitment had been tested many times over the years. In 1974, when Ian Ball tried to kidnap her on the Mall, she had refused to go quietly. "Bloody likely," she told him when he threatened to shoot. The story had become legend, proof of the princess's steel. But Anne rarely spoke of it. When asked about the incident years later, she had mused that, "Perhaps your greatest danger is still the lone nutcase who has just got enough to put it together." It was a characteristically understated assessment. Now, at 75, Anne showed no signs of slowing down. The Times of London had recently reported that she wanted to keep working until she was 90, though she might slow down a bit in her 80s. And given that King Charles was undergoing cancer treatment, it seemed likely that she would still be working when William became king. At a prison in West Yorkshire, Anne spent 2 hours talking with inmates and staff. She asked thoughtful questions about rehabilitation programs, about mental health support, about the challenges of re-entering society. The governor, a veteran of the prison service, was impressed. "She doesn't just go through the motions," he told a colleague afterward. "She actually listens." That evening, Anne returned to Gatcombe Park, her country estate. She changed out of her formal clothes and went for a walk with her dogs, as she did most evenings when she was home. The estate was quiet, removed from the chaos of London. Here she could be herself, not a princess, not a royal, just a woman who loved horses and the countryside. Her grandchildren were visiting for the weekend, and Anne looked forward to seeing them. And she had always been close to her children, Peter and Zara, and had made the deliberate choice to raise them without royal titles so they could have as normal a life as possible. The decision had paid off. Both had built successful careers and seemed genuinely happy. As darkness fell over Gatcombe Park, Anne allowed herself a moment of reflection. The Andrew crisis would pass, as all crises did. The monarchy would survive, as it always had. But survival was not enough. And the institution needed to mean something, to stand for something. That was why she kept working, kept showing up, kept doing the job day after day. It was not about preserving the past. It was about building a future. The Royal Mint had recently issued a commemorative coin for Anne's 75th birthday. On it was inscribed a motto, "Duty and Devotion." It was, she had to admit, not a bad summary of a life's work. A week after Andrew's arrest, the royal family gathered at Windsor Castle for a private dinner. It was not a formal occasion, just family, gathered to mark the end of a difficult period. The king presided, looking tired but composed. Camilla sat beside him, her warmth softening the formal setting. William and Catherine represented the next generation, their presence a reminder of continuity. And Anne was there, of course. She had driven herself from Gatcombe Park, arriving without fanfare or fuss. At dinner, she sat between her brother Edward and her nephew, engaging in the kind of easy conversation that only family can sustain. The Andrew crisis was not resolved. It would take months, perhaps years, to fully play out. But the immediate danger had passed. The family had weathered the storm, not by hiding, but by working. Charles had made clear that the law must take its course. Camilla had reminded them of the human cost of scandal. William had pushed for accountability. And Anne had simply kept going, day after day, proving by her example what service meant. After dinner, the family moved to the green drawing room for coffee. The conversation turned inevitably to the future. William spoke of his plans for the monarchy when his time came. A leaner, more focused institution, stripped of the excess that had accumulated over centuries. Charles listened, nodding occasionally. He had his own vision, of course. But he also understood that the crown must pass eventually to the next generation. Anne said little during this discussion. She had never been one for grand plans or strategic visions. Her contribution was different, more fundamental. She was the keeper of the flame, the guardian of the old values that had sustained the monarchy through darker times than these. Her presence was a reminder that service was not a strategy, but a way of life. As the evening wound down, Anne prepared to leave. She had an early engagement the next morning, a visit to an agricultural college in the Midlands. The fog was predicted to be heavy, so she would need to leave well before dawn. It was, she reflected, just another day's work. At the door, she paused and looked back at the family gathered in the drawing room. Charles was speaking animatedly with William, their heads bent together in conversation. Camilla was laughing at something Catherine had said, and Edward and Sophie were talking quietly with the Queen's cousins. It was, Anne thought, a picture of continuity, generations bound together by history and duty. She stepped out into the night, pulling her coat close against the cold. The castle loomed behind her, ancient and enduring. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Anne smiled slightly and walked toward her car. In the morning, she would be in the Midlands, shaking hands and asking questions, and doing the work she had done for 5 decades. The Andrew crisis would fade, replaced by other challenges, other scandals, other tests. But Anne would still be there, showing up, day after day, year after year. Duty and devotion. It was, she had long ago decided, enough. The car pulled away from Windsor Castle, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Behind her, the lights of the castle glowed warm and steady. Ahead lay the road, the fog. It's the early start, the endless round of engagements that defined her life. Princess Anne settled into her seat and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Business as usual. That, after all, was the point.